Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Miranda McKie, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Toronto. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about utilizing data-driven techniques to identify and mitigate systemic institutional barriers that impact underrepresented groups. This is a really, really important topic. I think in this day and age, we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and there's a variety of ways to approach that work. Some of it's mindset, some of it's things like unconscious bias. There are trainings, there are various things that we can do within our groups to improve our communication, etc. Often what isn't talked about enough in this space, I think, is the systemic issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how policies, practices, procedures can negatively impact underrepresented groups. And taking a data-driven, data-informed approach on how to tackle that is very, very important. So this is what we're going to be unpacking together today. As we get started, I wanted to share Miranda's bio with everybody. Miranda McKie is a visionary leader, founder, and CEO of McKie Consultants with a deep passion for data and design. Her expertise in HR and people analytics, product management, design thinking, and training enables her to help her clients achieve their strategic organizational goals. In the HR domain, she has a proven track record of utilizing data-driven techniques to identify and mitigate systemic institutional barriers, as we mentioned. In the product management domain, she works with clients around the globe to implement best-in-class SaaS platforms. Miranda, great to have you. Anything you would like to highlight by way of your background or personal context before we dive on in?
No, it's just great to be here and really excited to jump into the conversation.
All right, well, why don't we start by just talking a little bit more around what you see, like why a focus on the systemic issues and these institutional barriers in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, great question. So I think often when we see a lot of initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion, it tends to be very tick the box. So I know you mentioned earlier some of the concepts around training and unconscious bias, which are really obviously things that need to be addressed and are very helpful. But in the long scheme of things, we're not necessarily making huge amounts of change when we're just kind of addressing some of those surface areas. So when we dive into some of those systemic barriers, we're able to get a little bit more into the root cause of what some of these challenges are so that we can truly make long-lasting change. So an example would be, as you mentioned earlier, some of the procedures, the policies, the practices that are embedded into an organization over a period of time. I think when a lot of people go into I like to be maybe a little bit more optimistic about DEI. I don't think anyone comes into work and says, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to make a racist policy. That doesn't
Right.
happen. And from my experience, I don't really see that in the workforce. But what I do see are policies, procedures, and practices that have been embedded in over a period of time when you think of how long lasting a lot of these organizations are. And then that's what kind of creates those institutional and systemic barriers that are really embedded in the fabric of the organization and which makes them much harder to change. So when we start to actually address those challenges, especially as ideologies have changed over the years, then we're able to really address, what are some of those challenges and make more positive impact that can actually support the organization as well strategically, as opposed to more of the, easy to address, tick the box ones that are, kind of easy to tackle.
Yeah. And I don't want to be dismissive of any kind of work in this space. It's all important. We need more people having these conversations, doing things to try to change hearts and minds and help people be more aware of their own biases and how they interact with people, etc. But there are a lot of efforts in organizations that really are kind of tick the box. Like, is there really commitment behind it? Or is it really just to be able to say this is something that we do? And I think we've all seen that a lot of it is either kind of PR stuff or, employer branding stuff without any real commitment behind it. And so if I'm an employee and, some big social event happens, my organization's, releases a statement talking about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And even internally, there's that language. But then I see day in and day out actually things that aren't consistent with that. Then, what am I going to believe as an employee? How safe am I going to feel? Now, I say that I'm a straight cisgender white dude, so I have lots of privilege. I'm fine. But if I was part of an underrepresented group, I probably wouldn't feel so great. And even me, as someone who's trying to be an ally, when I see those kind of incongruencies, it really bothers me. And to your point, I don't think most people wake up in the morning thinking, how am I going to be prejudiced or discriminatory today? I mean, there are those bad actors. They do exist. But by and large, most people want to do right by others and they want to treat people with dignity and respect. But people can't always see those systemic issues because it's how it's always been. And sometimes even if we start to try to tackle those systemic issues, some people, like, say a straight cisgender white dude who has all these layers of privilege, might even start to feel like they are being attacked because some of their privilege is maybe under fire a little bit. And that leads to a lot of the discord and the challenges in this space. But being
100%.
open to just acknowledging that there are so many embedded things that may, by and large, seem innocuous to a lot of people, might be disproportionately hurting in some way other groups that maybe we may not be aware of. That's why it's so important to have continual dialogue around these issues. But even more than just the dialogue, now we start to get into this data-driven approach to how we really understand what's happening. So let's talk more about that. What are some of the types of data-driven techniques that you utilize when trying to identify these systemic institutional barriers so that you can start to put in place, revisions and policy changes and make adjustments that will benefit everybody?
Yeah, great question. And just on what you were saying, completely agree with, a lot of it being around that tick the box. A lot of employers are starting to use DEI, especially as a way of marketing. It's kind of this really easy way of marketing, I think, for them, instead of having to go out and pay for like an influencer or someone to come in. So I think there's also that challenge too. But in terms of a data perspective, there's a lot of things to look at. Obviously, there's employee data. There's community data, there's your supplier data, and I'll just kind of talk to kind of all of those areas. So when we're talking about employees, and often in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I don't know what's happened with this profession. I think after the murder of George Floyd, there's been a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a profession has been around forever. But after the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of conversations really around race and ethnicity as the main factor around diversity. Now, even in recent years, we're seeing a lot more around the LGBTQ plus and trans space. But there's, the word diversity is really what makes you diverse. So, even as you mentioned, you're a cis white, male, but I'm sure there's other aspects of you that make you diverse, maybe where you were educated, your socioeconomic status, all of those different attributes that make you you. So when we're talking about collecting that diversity data, a lot of organizations now are just looking at, maybe race and ethnicity, but it goes beyond that. So looking at how are we capturing a candidate's or determining potentially a candidate coming in their socioeconomic status from university or college. Were they maybe having to work 3 jobs? Is that why their grades were maybe lower than someone that didn't? Should we give them maybe a little consideration when we're hiring them there? There's looking at things.
Plus, by the way, can I just comment on that really briefly, because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine? Wouldn't we prefer someone who is really had that grit and that like hard work mentality, who's put themselves through school, has work experience? Wouldn't we prefer that anyways to somebody who maybe has a slightly 100%. Higher GPA but no work experience? I mean, that boggles my mind, but I see that kind of bias all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, just on that point alone, like that's why, I think, there's a few around diversity, equity, and inclusion is the right thing to do, but I think what's been lost in a lot of the conversations, especially in recent years, that it's the smart strategic business decision.
Right.
And it helps to make sure that you're attracting not only, creating equal opportunities, but you're attracting the right people to your organization and you're keeping the right people that can drive your organization forward. So that example, if we're now not just looking at, socioeconomic status, but we're trying to find a measurement of grit. So what determines grit at our organization and how do we use data to be an indicator of that? We're going to have probably a better employee at the organization as opposed to just looking at these very easy metrics like grades. So, on that, right? So organizations will look at everything from, employee data. They do things like engagement surveys, but I see organizations that really do it well is when, not to get too data heavy, but when they're able to tie demographics to an employee record. So you're able to see across the board really and understand, the trend. So I'll just give a simple one. Are women being proportionally promoted at higher or lower proportional rates than men? Is there an issue there? Are caregivers not taking access of professional development opportunities, maybe because they have not giving allocated time because of maybe challenges at home? So you want to be able to essentially track that data across the entire employee lifecycle so you can better understand what's going on. And then similarly, you want to look at your community data. I see this all the time when I go into organizations, especially even in Canada. There's a lot of hiring targets around what the term is called BIPOC. I don't love the term, but Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And especially for Black and Indigenous, if we talk about that group, I live in Toronto. In Ontario, there's a really low proportion of people that actually identify as Indigenous in the city. So organizations will make really broad hiring targets of like, we're going to 5% of our workforce is going to be, First Nations Indigenous. Well, there's not even 5% represented in the community. So how are you going to capture that pipeline? How are you going to actually bring in those individuals? So we're setting ourselves up to fail when we're not using data to understand that benchmarking piece. And then the last piece where I encourage employers to look at as well is the supplier side. So often when organizations, again, think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're just thinking about the employees as opposed to suppliers and the community that they're serving. So when we think about it from a supplier perspective, are we only procuring contracts with these one or two different organizations? How are we giving back to the community in terms of getting access to financials to uplift other organizations? So there's a lot that we can do to start to use data to drive the strategic business decisions. And I always give the example. I find DEI, just because it is such an emotional field, that a lot of people go into it with emotion first instead of being data driven. So it's a lot more on lived experiences as opposed to what is actually the root cause and what is the data telling us. So the more that we're able to do that, the more we can look at DEI like any other business function where it's data driven.
And just a quick example too. I was talking to someone recently where they shared the example. It was a female entrepreneur, and she'd gone to pitch at a venture capital firm. I don't remember all the details, but essentially, that's what's going on. And she's in there, and the presentation is over, and she just asks the room, which is filled with a bunch of guys. She asked the room, I'm sorry, I need to use the bathroom. Can you point me to the bathroom, like the nearest women's bathroom? And they'd been in business for years and they had no idea. That was like literally the first time anyone had asked.
Wow.
Which tells you something, right? It tells you that they probably haven't had many females in to pitch to them in the years that they've been in operation. And so to your point, it's not just about employees, that's important, but like whatever you do as a firm, are you looking for equal representation, equal opportunity? And it's not to say that that room full of guys was intentionally trying to be misogynistic or sexist or anything like that. My guess is it just had never crossed their mind. And they hadn't been proactively trying to create a space where females might come in and pitch. But it wasn't, probably on purpose. But that's the point, right?
Yeah.
Is that whether or not it's on purpose, whether or not it's our intention, we should be doing better for ourselves, for our organizations, for our people, for our clients, for anyone that we're interacting with, and just being a little bit, thoughtful, take a step
It,
back, challenge some assumptions. Uh,
exactly.
that
And
can go a really long way.
and on that as well, right? When you do that, you're getting, again, tying that back to the objectives. So especially in my line of work, I'm often tasked with convincing people to invest in this that don't really care as much and think it's the right thing to do. So even
Mm-hmm.
that example of, okay, maybe why are we not attracting more women to come pitch, and what are we potentially missing out on, and potential products that we could be investing in our
Right.
portfolios. And we're now seeing that a lot more too. Even, I don't know if you've ever used Bluetooth, and if in your car, as an example, I always give this example, and maybe you're with a woman who tries to use Bluetooth and she can't connect. The reason that she struggles, or at least before was struggling to connect, was because of poor testing data. So they were primarily testing with, like male voices, so women couldn't connect. But then what does that do to your actual sales of your product when a
Mm-hmm.
whole
Mm-hmm.
group of the population can't use it, doesn't like it, and is creating frustration? So when you start to have that lens as well, that changes that whole conversation a bit. It was the same when Snapchat with like the filters. If you were a dark-skinned individual, the filters wouldn't show up. They're not going to use the product. So again, tying that back into that lens of inclusivity and equality can help drive your product and your business growth.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really great example too. I have voice recognition privilege. Um,
I
like
love that.
for
I've never
whatever
heard that before. I
for
love
for
that.
whatever reason, it just works great for me, right?
Yeah.
It has worked great for me. It's wonderful. I love it. I use it all the time. But I know it doesn't work the same for a whole lot of other people. And part of it's just it was built for me, right? It was built for me. And unless I stop and realize that for a second, then I could make assumptions about other people who, in whatever way. Or another one, I joke with my wife. I have 4 daughters as well. So I joke with
Oh,
my
wow.
wife and my daughters all the time about pocket privilege. So like in my attire, I have
Oh,
men have
oh,
big
yes.
pockets. I have
What is
lots of
with that?
pockets.
Yeah.
And female fashion doesn't often have a lot of pockets or not big pockets. So we joke about my pocket privilege that I have, which, for the most part, I don't even think about until they're complaining about not having a place to put their phone. So there's just these
Exactly.
silly
Yeah.
little things that, well, I say it's silly. To me, it seems like not a big deal, but for someone who has to deal with it day in and day out, it is a big deal, right? And it,
Yeah.
it does
Yeah.
it does influence your behavior, whether that's buying
Yeah.
behavior or workplace behavior or whatever. So again, just being aware of that and having that data-driven approach is really helpful because we have lived experience is absolutely important too. We need to talk to living experts. We need to understand the lived experience. But anecdotally, we can hear all
Hmm.
sorts of things. So we need to be able to look kind of bigger scale at like what the meta trends are around these types of issues for these different populations. It's also important
100%.
to note that these groups aren't a monolith, that there's all these layers of diversity. So I mentioned I'm a straight cisgender white dude, right? Yes. So I have all these privileges, but I come from a very poor family, poor background. So socioeconomically, in some ways, underprivileged. But educationally overprivileged. Like there's all these different layers and everyone has them. And
Exactly.
so whether, you're talking about a woman of color or you're talking about whatever, like in some ways you might be privileged and in other ways you might be disadvantaged. And so just
100%.
just being able to
And
parse the data that way will help you make better decisions.
And that's the concept of intersectionality, right? Is where
Yeah.
you have all of these, different overlapping forms of potential discrimination that can impact you. And again, I think in this narrow view that we have all of a sudden, I blame a lot of social media because of it.
Mm.
We only think of, these types of groups of people can have these challenges. Whereas you mentioned, even, you just mentioned you have 4 daughters. I'm sure that was challenging, as a parent and raising four kids, right, and working and all that stress that comes with that too. So how are we building supports, understanding the different groups of people that we have, and not just bucketing people into these groups? I always give that example. I'm biracial, I'm mixed, and I would always be surprised that organizations. I spend a lot of time in management consulting too, and there would always be programs for Black women, right, and they would do that, and it's like, Well, my needs as a Black woman who's, at the time in my 20s was very different than someone who was in their 40s and has kids. And right. So, why are we now putting us all into this one bucket, assuming that this is our goals and trajectory? So, I think organizations need to open up their minds more to thinking through like, how are we using data to make strategic decisions about our workforce? And how are we
Yeah.
prioritizing the initiatives that we want to focus on based on, again, how that will help drive some of our business outcomes?
And the bottom line is buckets are easy, right? That's
Yeah,
why it happens. So
exactly.
we label people, we put them into buckets, and then we feel like, okay, now we got something, and
Yeah.
check the box. And there's really no substitute for leaders within an organization. I mean, this data-driven approach at a broad scale, having a large amounts of data to look at trends across groups and intersectionalities and stuff is really important. But there's also really no substitution for leaders just knowing their people. Like just members of your team, you should know them. Like part of being a good leader is knowing your people, understanding where they're coming from, what motivates them, what their challenges are, both in the workplace and outside, and how that those intersect. All of that, it's good leadership. Like you just have to know your people, and it doesn't even matter if we're talking about diversity. It's just generally speaking, like you
I
need to know
completely
people.
agree. I find
And
it so funny when I'll go into these organizations and they'll be like, we need a program. I'll just keep using that example for Black women. What do you
mhm,
think we need, Miranda? I'm like, have you talked to your employees? Have you
yeah.
asked them what their goals are? And they're like, oh, we never, never thought about that, right? Well, instead, so it's just very interesting that you still have that huge gap, I too think, with leadership and like having good coaches for those leaders so that they can truly support their employees that are working for them and motivate them and make sure that their needs are being met.
Yeah. Or you have that well-intentioned leader who says, I have, a woman of color who works with me who said this. And because of that, let's do a system-wide, organizational policy and launch this new program. Okay, I mean, it's nice that you got that one perspective from one person, but like, have you talked to other people? Like,
Yes, exactly.
have you taken a broader approach to try to understand? And while I can recognize and appreciate the intention behind, taking that anecdotal piece of evidence and then running with it and the willingness to do that, I can appreciate that. But is it going to lead to good decision making for your organization? And are other people going to be seen and heard when you're rolling out this new policy or this new program? Regardless of what your intention is. And that's the thing is I mean, I do want people to have good intentions. Don't get me wrong. I think intentions matter. But what really matters is what you actually do. Like someone could have crummy intentions, but still put in place a really organizationally, a psychologically safe organization, a really well-run organization, diverse organization, lots of great approaches to their programming. And maybe what's going on in their head isn't like great and
Yeah,
something I wouldn't love, but honestly, the impacts are going to be so positive that that's okay.
yeah,
In an ideal world, we're going to have both. We're going to have like great intentions and great implementation, but ultimately it's the implementation that really matters the most.
a
And
hundred
so
percent.
make sure you have those conversations so you can get past your intention and get to what's actually going to work.
And I completely agree, especially with the implementation piece. I think what we see in modern today's world, at least with DEI professionals, you'll have, one DEI person for an entire like 10,000 person company. And then like how are they going to be able to implement and push those initiatives forward? So you're kind of putting these people into these roles with they may have great ideas, great thoughts, but then where does it fall down on that implementation and on that change management piece? So then we don't see these huge and these this big progress and change. So I think there's a lot more that we can do in that space, as well as just making really more sustainable goals. I always give the example too of comparing DEI to what we see a lot with climate change. Now, not saying climate change has it figured out by any means, but at least a lot of the goals are longer term. By 2050, we want to be carbon emissions by X amount. Whereas with DEI, it's like by next year we want to eradicate racism. Okay, like like that's not a realistic goal. So how do we start kind of building that and then building an implementation plan that can support those long-term goal year after year?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well said. Well, this has just been a great conversation. I know at the time I need to let you go, but before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, for sure. So if you'd like to reach out, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can go to Miranda McKie and find me there. You can also go to our website at McKieConsultants.com. We also have a ton of different resources and white papers that we've written, some very interesting on gamification in recruitment and how that can support DEI, as well as some on women of color and the pay equity gap. So I highly recommend you checking those out. And just as a final word, I would encourage you all, even if it is small and you're just starting out with data and it's descriptive analytics, you don't have to get into the AI space, but start thinking about how can we start incorporating data into our DEI decision making to really help to kind of drive that progress forward in a more strategic way.
Yeah, well said. Miranda, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Miranda can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.